Hello, my name is Vivian Ip from the University of Alberta Hospital in Edmonton, Canada. And I'm here with Dr. Michael Mulroy, who served as the ASRA president from year 2000 to year 2001 and received the Gaston Labat Award in 2007. This interview is part of the activities surrounding the 100th anniversary of the founding of the first American Society of Regional Anesthesia in 1923 by Gaston Labat and colleagues. Although this organization is not related to the current day ASRA Pain Medicine, which was founded in 1975, it has been said that the current society would not have existed quite like it does without the work of Dr. Labat and the original ASRA. I'd like to welcome Dr. Michael Mulroy. And thank you, Dr. Mulroy, for being here today. And so firstly, I'd like to ask you the question, what led you to choose the field of regional anesthesia?
Well, Vivian, I actually started out on a career in general surgery because I like doing things with my hands and like being productive. My surgery residency was interrupted by the Vietnam draft, which gave me time to think about what parts I had enjoyed the most about my training, and that actually turned out to be my anesthesia rotations. And in anesthesia, it was the ability to do procedures like neural blocks, epidurals, spinals. I enjoyed the challenge of actually hands-on producing things. And during my anesthesia residency at UC San Francisco, Dr. Gail Thompson, who was on the staff of the Virginia Mason Clinic in Seattle, happened to come down to do a year's sabbatical. And I talked to Gail a lot and enjoyed seeing what he did with nerve blocks. And I got very excited about doing that. So when it came time to actually work for a living, I got a job at the Mason Clinic and worked there for a dull, boring 37 years. So, and saw a lot of changes in the way we do regional anesthesia, but it was always fun.
Right. How did the field evolve over your career?
It's a long story. Just as general anesthesia changed with the advent of pulse oximetry and CO2 monitoring and the new agents, regional anesthesia changed also. We started out, one of the drawbacks we had at the beginning was lidocaine was for a long time the longest acting local anesthetic we had. And that limited our ability to provide anesthesia for a lot of surgical procedures. So in my career, seeing the development of bupivacaine, etidocaine to provide longer duration of anesthesia. Tetracaine was available, by the way, but it was shied away from for peripheral blocks because of its narrow therapeutic margin. And bupivacaine turned out to be a much safer and effective drug. And the shift to that in our practice really allowed us to expand to a lot more operations, and more particularly the development of catheters that were reliable. We had, remember doing epidurals with basically polyvinyl chloride catheters that would poke a hole in the dura almost as easily as the spinal needle. And then we tried Teflon catheters and they would kink if you just looked at them sideways. And the current generation of catheters, they're very flexible and yet maintain their lumen and have allowed us to give continuous techniques for days on end, which has been a major change in the way we can deliver the local anesthetics itself. The other big changes that highlight the profession since I've been in it was the evolution from the searching for paresthesias, which was uncomfortable for the patient and was always kind of suspect whether it caused nerve damage, was slowly but inevitably replaced by the use of nerve stimulators, which was a great advance. It sped up our ability to find nerves and block them reliably. And now ultimately in the last 15 years, the evolution of ultrasound, which has just made the whole field of regional anesthesia so much more effective and reliable, and has led to our ability to provide not only nerve blocks for surgery, but using the ultrasound to insert catheters. We're sending, one of my passions has been outpatient anesthesia and seeing, well, post-op pain relief and outpatient anesthesia. And that kind of goes hand in hand. If you can give good pain relief, then you can send people home from the hospitals. And now we started out giant major advances when we put catheters in for ACL repairs and sent young people home on crutches with an infusion for 2 or 3 days. And now they're even doing total joint replacements and sending them home the same day because of the ability to localize the nerves and insert catheters at very specific points to provide precise anesthesia. And the infusion pumps allow those blocks to continue on for days at a time. So I've seen a number of developments in the field that have allowed us as anesthesiologists, in particular regional anesthesiologists, to provide longer, better pain relief for our patients and really improve their recovery immediately and their rehabilitation even. So I've been excited about those kind of things. And
yeah, I mean, it's so interesting. It's fascinating how, the drug and the catheter techniques and, and the way we do and regional anesthesia has evolved over time, and it's just gotten much better and really in time with the current needs.
And I think it's very parallel to some of the things that have gone on in the profession as a whole. And like in my last several years of practice, trying to tell anesthesia residents that there was a time where we didn't have a pulse oximeter, and they look at me like, I don't believe it. And right. How did you ever do that? Well, we've come a long way.
Absolutely, yes. So what was the path of events that led to you becoming president of ASRA? What obstacles did you have to overcome to serve, and what advantages did you have?
Well, first of all, you need to know the background that, and it's a very long story. Regional anesthesia, we're talking about celebrating Gaston Labat's original ASRA back in 1923. And there was a time where he was kind of a lone voice for doing regional anesthesia, although there were other people around the country. But when his original society died off after his death several years later, that the energy was replaced by commitment to the ASA and the ABA by the staff. And there was the development of general anesthetics. I'm sorry, it's kind of long-winded, but it's a long path around. Pentothal came in, and what was it, 34, and curare agents that were made it a lot easier to give general anesthesia at a time when there was concern about nerve injuries with regional anesthesia, with tetracaine toxicity because of the narrow margin, and a number of dark clouds over regional anesthesia. The first being the Woolley and Rowe case in Great Britain. I can't remember the year, it was in the 40s, but basically it was paralysis from contamination of the local anesthetics when giving a spinal anesthetic, and a major lawsuit which cast again, a great dark cloud on doing regional in Great Britain. And at the same time in the US, there was an editorial written by a neurologist about the grave hazards of spinal anesthesia. And he had collected 12 cases of people who ended up paralyzed after spinal anesthetic. And the combination of the bad news for regional and the good news for general anesthesia, and particularly World War II saw a dramatic increase in number of physician anesthesiologists in this country, because people were drafted into the army They were given a 90-day course on how to do anesthesia. Well, you can't master regional anesthesia in 90 days, but you can give pentothal. And there's a whole group of a generation of anesthesiologists who came out after the war and were far more familiar and comfortable with general anesthesia. And that was a time eventually where halothane came on the market and a lot of other inhalation agents that made it easier. And there were dark days for regional techniques in the late 40s, early 50s. We still had Gaston Labat's original textbook, which was kind of the Bible for most people for doing regional blocks at that time. But there were only a few isolated centers in the United States where regional anesthesia was really dominant. One of them, interestingly, was Seattle. And in Seattle, there were two giants of the profession. John Bonica, who became the chairman at the University of Washington, was a passionate advocate of regional techniques for obstetrics and for pain relief. And his counterpart on the other side of town was Daniel Moore, who, after finishing his military service in 1947, came to the Virginia Mason Clinic and was hired to be the anesthesiologist to replace, or I should say, to improve the quality of care that was currently being given only by nurse anesthetists. And Dan Moore was, there is a connection here, we'll get to it, but Dan Moore was a passionate advocate of regional techniques, a fairly opinionated and strong-willed individual who was a bit of a perfectionist. And there were 3 operating rooms at Virginia Mason at the time. And Dan's only frustration was that he couldn't give the anesthesia in all 3 of them at the same time because he was the best man to do the job. So he loved doing regional techniques, and he was the first. And again, today you take for granted that you have an induction room to meet a patient and put a block in. There were none in those days. Dan invented the induction room by taking the anesthesia storeroom and putting stretchers in there. And this allowed him to do regional blocks in the induction room and then allow one of the nurse anesthetists to take the patient down the hall and sedate them during the surgical procedure while he'd do the block on the next patient for the next room. And in that way, Dan Moore succeeded in doing all of the pre-ops, all of the anesthetics, and all of the post-op visits for the surgeons at Virginia Mason from 1947 through the early 50s when he expanded his staff. But he, in 1953, published a new textbook of regional anesthesia that, for many, replaced Labat's original book. There were several advantages that made his textbook one of the most popular in the country, one of which was he only described one technique for each block. Labat had mentioned many variable approaches, but Moore gave practicing anesthesiologists a very clear-cut, simple cookbook style, 8 or 12 steps of how to do a block. And it was all laid out in a very clear, concise pattern and with multiple illustrations. And his textbook became kind of the Bible for many people for doing regional anesthesia. And his department at Virginia Mason became a real epicenter of regional techniques and of teaching residents how to do regional anesthesia. He recruited a staff, Don Breidenbau, Phil Breidenbau, Gail Thompson, and several others who all, again, were committed to doing regional anesthesia. And at one point, Moore claimed that 70% of the surgical cases at Virginia Mason were done with a regional block. And that's pretty impressive. And that's all, again, due to his efforts and his enthusiasm. He wasn't always the easiest person to get along with, you might imagine from that, but he certainly established a tradition there that was, the surgeons, you're often familiar with surgeons who say, I don't want to block, it takes too long, it doesn't work, yada, yada, yada.
Oh, yes.
Danny Moore's requested him to give regional anesthesia because it was so advantageous and so reliable. when ASRA was founded, as you know, Don Breidenbaugh from the Department of at Virginia Mason was one of the founding fathers. Dan had established a department that was a driving force in regional anesthesia, so that a number of the original members of ASRA were graduates of the department. And as you see, I think there's at least 5 of us who've been presidents of ASRA over the year, because we're the people who get involved with doing regional anesthesia. And because I was at Virginia Mason and I presented a number of scientific papers about regional anesthesia, and particularly about outpatient anesthesia, I eventually was invited to be the chairman for the annual scientific meeting in 1993. And that's the traditional stepping stone for getting onto the board and then becoming president. And that is indeed what happened with me. Because of my speaking experiences at meetings even outside the country, I had developed contacts with people in the European Society of Regional Anesthesia, basically because of my participation in the international and the national scientific meetings. I was elected to the board and eventually to be the president. What obstacles I think you actually asked the question, what obstacles did I face?
Yeah.
One of them was the growing popularity of regional anesthesia. That sounds stupid. What are you doing? You're an advocate of regional anesthesia and you say it's bad that it's growing. But what was happening is there were other groups around the country who were starting, this is by the year 2000, that were already starting. So Danny Moore's textbook was published in 1953. So we're talking about 45 years later. There's a cadre of people who are doing regional anesthesia, and they're using the new drugs and the new nerve techniques, and they're having success. And their success has prompted them to sponsor scientific meetings where they can invite speakers and do their own presentations about how wonderful their experience is. And that's great. That's all good news. But that was competing with ASRA for membership, and particularly for registration at the annual meeting, which is what the organization kind of depended upon, people coming to the meeting and paying the registration fee and paying their dues. And so, and bless his heart, Alan Winnie, as I mentioned earlier, one of the other strong advocates of regional technique. Now, they're interesting days. Alan Winnie was another character, not unlike Dan Moore. He was very strong-willed, opinionated, very capable, very charismatic person too. He gave great talks, great lectures. An amazing man, considering that he was crippled from polio from the day of his year of his internship. He was in a wheelchair, and the man still finished an anesthesia residency and established a department at Cook County Hospital in Chicago, where he taught a lot of regional anesthesia. And he was 1983, he published his book on plexus anesthesia, and he became another great guru of regional techniques, along with Bonica and Moore and the group that had been growing at the Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston under Ben Cavino, and also in the late 1990s, the group under Nigel Sherrick at the Hospital for Special Surgery in New York City had established, they did all orthopedic cases. So they used a lot of regional techniques and developed a lot of routines for doing that. And again, published a lot of articles, and they put on their own regional anesthesia workshop every December. And these organizations were in, Winnie, I think I left off, he published his book, gave a lot of lectures. He established a educational organization called the Dana Miller Foundation that then also gave courses on regional anesthesia every spring. And there was one of the obstacles we faced was trying to minimize the competition, enhance the cooperation, and not be stabbing each other in the back and stealing customers. And one of the projects of my presidency, in addition to getting the international symposium off the ground and running in 2000, was to have established rapport with some of these others, with Bill Ermey, who had taken over at the Hospital for Special Surgery. And we had some very productive discussions and basically an agreement that we would not, we would try not to compete with one another for the customers. And fortunately for all of us, the interest in regional anesthesia was growing so exponentially in the country that there were plenty of people around who wanted to belong to many organizations and who didn't mind going to 2 different meetings, and that was fine. And one of the other undercurrents during my time of presidency was the growing specialization in regional anesthesia. That there were those of us who did primarily, we were interested in surgical anesthesia and post-op pain relief. And there was a parallel tradition of anesthesiologists who were primarily focused on pain management and chronic pain management and the use of nerve blocks. And interestingly, out of the founding fathers, I think 3 out of the 5 of them were actually pain physicians, not surgical anesthesiologists. And that's always been an aspect of regional anesthesia, the duality of taking care of chronic patients, taking care of acute surgical patients. And that became, a little bit of it was a frustration with the annual meeting program. We had to discuss about how many lectures on chronic pain and how many lectures on surgical anesthesia were we going to include. And eventually, the wisdom of the society and the growth that inevitably went with it allowed the society to split into basically 2 meetings: an annual spring meeting on pain and a fall on surgical anesthesia, and a fall meeting on pain management. And that was, I can take no credit for that. That came after my time, but it was a conflict that was just under the surface during the time I was in office there. And I think the society has done a great job of serving both pathways and incorporating them.
Now, during your leadership, did ASRA move the bar? Did you change the way other anesthesiologists practice their regional anesthesia, or anything?
Well, I think
that comes to mind.
ASRA itself cannot take credit for moving the bar. The things that we've talked about already, the development of the new local anesthetics, development of the new nerve location techniques with the first the nerve stimulator and then ultrasound. And those are things that move the profession forward. ASRA, by providing an annual meeting forum where people could present their experience and talk about their techniques, and where, for even more important, the sales guys would sell their needles and their stimulators and their ultrasounds and their training videos. I think ASRA served as a catalyst for the dissemination of all of that information. But it was changes in the profession, in the whole marketplace itself. AstraZeneca was really responsible for the development of the drugs. ASRA can't take credit for it, but they certainly, the members of ASRA, like Danny Moore, did all of the original clinical studies on bupivacaine. So that moved the bar. But
so I guess ASRA helps bringing all the professionals together and networking and encourage ideas being bounced around.
And some camaraderie and some exchange. And it was,
right.
I mentioned the Hospital for Special Surgery and the relationship with them. After spending some time talking with them and exchanging it, we ended up with, one year they invited us to go to New York to give lectures on how we did it. And the next year we invited them to come to Seattle to give lectures on how they did it. And that camaraderie that comes from going to those meetings and sharing those things.
Right. Perfect. So what was the attitude of your department when you served on the board and then became, time committed as a president? Was your department
The
supportive?
department had always had a commitment to ASRA from the very beginning. And it was, what do I want to say? It's not, in many departments, they resent people taking time away. Well, we didn't get any time off to be president. We had to do that in our spare time. And that's the way Virginia Mason has always been. But it was almost an expectation that if you were going to be a mover in the department, that you would be doing some research, you should be doing some presentations, and you should be submitting your papers and your abstracts to the ASRA meeting. And I can't tell you how many of our anesthesia residents were involved in research projects and were encouraged and funneled to make those presentations at the ASRA meeting. There was not a resentment or a frustration about any of us being officers. It was like, isn't it your turn now? Aren't you supposed to do that? And it was an expectation that we would do it, and it was going to contribute. You know, it works both ways. We helped support ASRA. The fact that we were there and speaking and presenting also enhanced and continued to enhance the reputation of our department. And that's an interesting observation over the years. There have been a number of real gurus of regional anesthesia that I talked about, Alan Winnie being the classic one, Ben Cavino at Brigham and Women's, a lot who were giants in their own way in their days. But like Gaston Labat, when they died, their organization or their department just kind of petered out in terms of interest in regional anesthesia. But Virginia Mason has continued that for well over 50 years. And it's the backbone of the department. It's what we've always done.
Yeah. Now, of course, you received the Labat Award in year 2007. What was your initial reaction to the news?
No, that was humbling, very humbling. That group of, I've basically known all of those people during their careers, and they are some of the brightest and most creative contributors to our specialty and to anesthesia and in general and regional anesthesia in particular. So it was very humbling to be named into that group. And I haven't been one of those people who designed a new nerve block or a new nerve stimulator or did anything brilliantly creative. And so I felt, as I say, very, very humbled to be included in that group. That was my next reaction. My next reaction was, oh my God, I've got to give a lecture on something not about how many cases I did. So interesting. Yeah.
And what changes in thinking, practice, or perspective did you foster during your career?
My fascination starting after 2000 into 2008 with safety in the practice of anesthesia in particular, but medicine in general. And there was the Institute of Medicine report about the unnecessary deaths provoked and what we could do. And I became fascinated with Atul Gawande's work with the World Health Organization on using checklists for pre-surgical review to reduce the amount of the lack of communication and the errors. And I actually worked with Gawande's group that was doing some research in North Carolina, and worked with our institutional safety board in terms of creating, that was a big campaign for me, was to get the surgical checklist implemented at Virginia Mason. But we got a team together of nurses and some interested flexible surgeons and our anesthesia staff. And we took the World Health Organization checklist, we modified it to work in our institution. We modified it so that instead of the surgeon running down a list saying ... we had the nurses did their checklist, the anesthesiologists did their checklist, and the surgeons were allowed to do their checklist. But everybody spoke up, everybody was part of the team. There was some initial resentment, but basically our surgeons kind of said, this is a good idea. There's an annual award at Virginia Mason for the team that contributes most to the improvement in safety. And our team won that Mary McClinton Award that year. And the year after that, I was given the James Tate Mason Award, Virginia Mason, which is kind of a combination of Physician of the Year and Lifetime Achievement for whatever you did. And that, again, like the Labat, was quite an honor to be included in a group of people that I had high respect for what they had contributed over the years. And now all the way around to what did I do for anesthesia? We then took the principles used in developing that checklist, and I worked with three other anesthesiologists in ASRA to develop a pre-block checklist to use. And I think most institutions now have one form or another of a checklist which they go through before they do any procedures, including a regional anesthetic. And it includes the washing of the hands, the identification of the patient, the proper equipment, all of those steps. And again, I was very instrumental in doing that at Virginia Mason and improving what we think is the safety and the reliability of regional anesthesia. On top of that, the other thing that I'm probably going to be remembered for is efficiency in terms of, I was always watching a clock. I always kind of could tell how long it was going to take us to do a block and commit to our surgeons that that was the time it was going to be. And we got it done in that period of time. And my residents were always kind of shaking their head. Why is he looking at that clock? But we're going to do it. We're going to get it done. And if we take longer than that, the surgeons are going to start saying, I don't want my patients to get blocks, which was an atmosphere I had during my training in San Francisco. That was a real negative attitude about regional techniques. But there was a morning that one of our residents called in to say he was going to be late for work and he was having car trouble. Could we get somebody to cover his room and get his cases started, and then he'd be there as soon as he could. So he got in, came in, took over the case, was settling down, and we were saying, I thought, I was done. So sorry about your car trouble this morning. What was wrong? And he said, well, I didn't get into it early enough. I love that story because it's the story of regional anesthesia. It's not, how long it takes you to do a block. If you don't get started that soon before the case is ready to go, you're going to be late. So thinking ahead about planning your procedure and planning the start of your block so that you're ready to start your case. That's a very trivial part of medicine. It has nothing to do with highfalutin creative advances in the field, but it really allows for a much better patient experience and a much higher degree of cooperation with the surgeons. Because
yes,
if you tell them you're going to start on time and you start on time, then they say next time, okay. And then if you ever have a problem, you pick up the phone and say, we're having difficulties. You need 10 more minutes. They love it. Anyway, I'll stop.
Yeah, that is so true though. That is so true. And that's a really good tip for everybody. If you want to get surgeons buy-in for regional anesthesia, that's actually one of the very important points. Yeah.
You have an induction room. Yeah.
Right. What do you consider your greatest mentors?
People would say, oh, you're at Virginia Mason, so it must be Danny Moore. No, it's Gail Thompson, who I mentioned was the guy who came on sabbatical to San Francisco. Gail was just always fun. He always had some little tweak of humor he wanted to do. He, as a mentor, I guess one of the things I learned from him is not to do as he did. He hated change. When nerve stimulators came in, he said, bah, humbug. And then when the ultrasound came in, it was bah, bah, humbug. And he, I learned from him, have an open mind. Be creative, he was a poet. He loved to read poetry at some of the annual meetings. But Don Breidenbaugh was my other real favorite mentor. He was just one of the kindest, most capable, loving men that I've worked with. And he was the quiet one. And Dan Moore would always go to the meetings and give the lectures. Don Breidenbaugh would go with him, but he had to carry his suitcases. And that was the kind of guy Don was. Quiet, did the load. When it came to working in the operating room and you had a tough block, you called Don. And Don, he would just patiently come in and say, "Now, I think you might want to consider doing it this way." Oh, I still remember one day we were in the induction room when it was a big room. It had 6 stretchers at a time. And I was at one corner of the room trying to do an interscalene block. And he was at the other corner doing an epidural. And he looks over and says, "About 1 inch to the left." He's on the other side of the room. He hasn't touched the patient. He's telling her to put the needle. And he was just always kind and always gentle about that way. And always could look and see both sides of the story. Just a very patient guy. He died just 3 years ago, and he and I had a good working relationship all through life, to the point where his family asked me to give the eulogy at his funeral, which, again, that was as big an honor as the Labat for that man in my life. But those are the 2 mentors that meant the most to me.
Right. Now, finally, what words would you choose to define ASRA?
Oh, some of the things that we talked about already: the collegiality, camaraderie, the getting people together, the flexibility that it has shown over the years, because the original ASRA kind of only had one path that it went down, and Robenstein, who took over for Labat, as you probably know, because everyone's read the history of the original ASRA, but Robenstein, who took over, he was interested in pain medicine, and that's what he wanted to do, not the general. The current ASRA has managed to continue to be productive because it has been flexible in allowing the chronic pain people and the acute pain people to work together in the same organization, publish in the same journal, and support one another. So, and you'd also say resilient. It has come through a number of the challenges that I talked about. Those are words that come to my mind.
Thank you so much. It's been such an honor to be able to interview you, Dr. Mulroy.